Hello, this is Amin, and this is session 48 of ASP.NET Core MVC tutorial. In this session, we are going to create a repository which handle CRUD operation for our web application, and also we will upgrade the .NET framework from version 5 to version 6. Generally, interfaces and repositories are a layer between database and controller, and we connect database to controller with the repository that we have, and we can handle CRUD operation, which is create, read, update, and delete operations within the repository. And repositories help us to move the logic of the application to another layer, and we don't put the logic in the controller, and in the controller we use the repository to connect our web application to the database. In the previous sessions we create a static repository, and in this session we are going to create another repository which use SQL Server for storing data and also reading the data. And as you can see, in the SQL COS repository, we need web app DB context, the DB context that we created for our web application. And then through this object of web app DB context, we can work with the database, and we can store and read and update and delete the records inside the database. Also, for switching between the repositories, we can use a startup class, and we can use the services. As you can see here, we can switch between the repository with just changing one line of code. We already discussed this topic in the previous sessions, and in this session we will show you how you can switch between the repositories. And these are the codes which is related to SQL Server repository. Let's flip to Visual Studio and implement the SQL Server repository, and also create CRUD operation repository for both static and SQL Server repository. This is the project that we have been working so far throughout this tutorial. And if you remember, in previous session, I have modified cost and category models, and we make a one-to-one relationship between cost and category. And also I have modified cost, and if you remember, I deleted the static data that I had inside the static cost repository. In this session, I will complete ICostRepositoty to handle CRUD operation for cost model and cost domain class. Inside ICostRepository, as you can see, I have just get cost by ID and get all cost, which is related to read data from the database or from the static repository. I will add 3 more declaration here for creating a cost record, updating a cost record, and also deleting a cost record. As you can see, for create operation, I return an object of cost, and also for update, I will return an object of cost, and also I receive an object of cost as a updated data. And also for delete, I just receive the ID of record that I want to be deleted. Let me implement these changes inside the static repository, but before implementing these changes, first I copy and paste the static data which meet more requirement based on the changes that I have applied on cost model. Here I just copy the code which is related to a static repository that I want to use, and the code is available inside the website and also inside my GitHub. And here, as you can see, it is mentioned that some of the method is not implemented here, because a StaticCostRepository is implemented from ICostRepository, and I just added 3 more method there. By pressing Ctrl period key, I can implement the method which I added inside the interface. And here you can see I have create, delete, and also update method. For create purpose, I can use add method, and add method is receive a object of a cost, which is new cost, and then I return the new cost that I created. Also for delete, first I should find the record that I want to be deleted. For this purpose, I can store the result of my search inside an object of cost, and inside the static data that I have, which is inside the cost variable, which is object of cost, which include the static data. And here I can use first or default, and with lambda expression I can find the value that I want, and I'm looking for the ID. That's why I can search for the ID, and the ID should be equal the ID that I received from the input parameter. If the record exists, I can delete it in the next step. That's why I should use a condition and check whether the record that I'm looking for exists inside the static repository or not. If the selected cost would not be null, it means the ID that I receive exists inside the database. Then I can remove it with the remove method, and the remove method receive a object of cost, which is selected cost. Then I can return the selected cost as a return object, and also if I won't be able to find the selected data, I can return just null. And for update purpose, I first need to find the record which I received through input parameter. That's why I can use this piece of code which I use for delete purpose, and I paste it here. But just this time I should find the ID of the object of cost that I received from the input parameter. That's why I use update cost and ID. If the ID that I receive from the input parameter, which is inside the object of cost, I can update that value of data, and if I find it, I can update it with the data that I receive. For this purpose, I equal the old value with the updated value. And then I return the updated value. Now I created the CRUD operation for the static cost repository, and now I have all the operation that I need, which is create, read, update, and delete. Now I want to create another repository for cost interface and for cost model to handle CRUD operation for SQL Server database. That's why first I need to add cost method as a DB set inside web app DB context. If you remember in the previous sessions, I add just category as a DB set. Now I add another property, and its type is DB set, and DB set of cost, which is the related to cost method, and its name would be costs. Then I create another class inside the model, I set its name as SQL Server Cost Repository. This repository should be implemented from ICostRepository. And then I need to implement the method which is declared inside the ICostRepository. And also for working with the database, I need to add DB context here. That's why I should use the constructor for this repository. And inside this constructor, I should inject the web app DB context. And then I need to add a read-only object of this DB context. And for this purpose, I press counter period and add the read-only object. And now I can use this context to have access to the database. For create purpose, I need to use context. And inside the context, I should add the model that I want, which is cost, and then add. And inside the add, I need an object of the cost, which is new cost. And then I need to save these changes and apply these changes inside the database. For this purpose, I can use save changes method. And then I return new cost. This is the first operation, which is creates a new record inside a database to cost model. And then I'm going for delete. Somehow this piece of code is look like the code that I use in StaticCostRepository. That's why I copy the code from that place. And I just paste it here. And this time, instead of cost, which is the object of cost that I use in a static repository, I use context, and then I use cost. And inside the cost, I can use first or default, same as the code that I mentioned inside the static cost repository. And then here for removing the data, again, I use context. And I should use cost and then remove. But I need to save data after removing the record from the context cost DB set. For this purpose, I use again save changes to save the data. Just bear in mind, I have save changes and save changes async, which save the data asynchron. But for time being, I just use save changes. And in the upcoming session, I will talk about asynchron method, which has also add async, remove async, and the rest. But for time being, I just use the add, remove, and the rest of the code that I need. And then for get all costs, I use context and I return context.cost, which include all the record inside the cost. And for get cost by ID, I again return context.cost.first or default. And with lambda expression, I'm looking for the ID that I receive its ID. And for update, I have two scenarios that you can use both for updating data. In the first scenario, I can attach the updated data to the cost, and then I can modify it by change the status of the entity. And the second scenario is the way that I already used in static repository. First, I described the way that I use in a static cost repository. That's why I copy and paste the code here and modify it to be used with SQL Server. This is the code that I was using inside the static repository, and also here I should use context and cost, and then here I can update the data, and just here I need to save changes after updating the data inside the selected cost. This is the first way. Now I comment this piece of code and use another way which we can use for update purpose in the repository. I use context, cost, and then I attach the data that I receive through input parameter. And then I use this object that I created here. And its state should be modified. That's why I use Microsoft.entity-framework-core.entity-state.modified. And then I use save the changes, and then return the updated data. Just I have a typo here inside the ICostRepository, and I'm going here and I change this one to T and save it. And also I should do these changes inside the static repository as its name is changed, and it seems I should change it here, and also everywhere that I use this object of cost. And I save it. And also inside the SQL Server repository, here I should change it to cost, and here I should change again them to cost. I save the changes and build the project to see whether I have any error or not. Project built successfully. And now I review the way that I can switch between the repository. I can switch easily between the repositories which I created for different purposes. And this is the benefit of the dependency injection. For change the repository, I should go to a startup class. And here you can see I bind the ICostRepository to a StaticCostRepository, and I can use services and add a scope. And then I use ICostRepository. And this time I connect it to SQL Server Cost repository and open and close parentheses. And now I can remove or comment this line. And if I build this project, this time I will use the SQL Server repository instead of the repository that I used earlier, which was the static repository. I will talk more about the type of the service that I can use, add singleton, add scope, and add transient in upcoming session. And once more, I built the project to see whether I have any error or not. Project is built successfully, and I can launch the project. Just I need to add a view for home index to avoid the application to receive 404 error. That's why I create an empty Razor view, and its name would be index, which will be created automatically inside the home subfolder. And just I use a div element, and inside the div element I use a paragraph, and I mentioned home. Let me save the project and run the project once to see the result. As you can see, project is up and running, and it means I created a repository and CRUD operation successfully. The next step is upgrading the framework from version 5 to version 6, which is the latest version that is released at time of recording this video. Let me close this project and back to Visual Studio to upgrade my project to .NET version 6. I provide you the link, which is the detail of this upgrade, but if you use Visual Studio inside Microsoft Windows, you need to upgrade your Visual Studio to version 2022. But if you are using Visual Studio Code, you need to upgrade your Visual Studio Code and upgrade your C# version to latest version, and also you need to download .NET 6 SDK and install the SDK. And if you use Visual Studio for Mac, you need to upgrade your Visual Studio to version 2022, and also you need to download .NET 6 SDK. But as long as I'm using Visual Studio here, first I check whether with version 2019 it is possible to upgrade the framework or not, and then I will switch to Visual Studio version 2022. This is my project inside Visual Studio 2019, and I can check the version of Visual Studio from help about Microsoft Visual Studio. And as you can see, this is the Microsoft Visual Studio Community 2019. And I will check whether .NET 6 is available inside this one or not. I've already installed the .NET 6 SDK, but you can see when I'm going to project, you can go to the project property with right click on the name of the project and go to properties, and here inside the application I have target framework, but you can see the latest version that I have here is .NET version 5. Let me open this project with Visual Studio 2022 and check whether I'm able to upgrade this web application to .NET Framework version 6 or not. And this time I open my project with Visual Studio 2022, and I can check the version of the Visual Studio with help about Microsoft Visual Studio. And you can see this is the Microsoft Visual Studio Community 2022. And this time when I right click on daily cost web application, which is name of my web application, and go to properties, inside the application general I have .NET 6 as a target framework, and now I can upgrade my .NET framework to version 6. Let me save the changes and build the project to check whether my code is compatible with version 6 or not. You can see my project built successfully, and also I need to upgrade the NuGet packages that I installed earlier to be compatible with .NET version 6. For this purpose, I'm going to dependency and right click on the dependencies, and I'm going to manage NuGet packages. And as long as I'm using SQL Server and I will not use MySQL as a database, I can remove this NuGet package, which is provider to connect our web application to MySQL. Here I can upgrade my NuGet packages with several ways. The first way is selecting the package that I want, and from the version I can select the version that I want, which I can select the last stable version, which is 6.0.2, and I can press the upgrade key. And then I can accept the license, and the upgrade process, it depends on your internet connectivity speed. And also the next way is clicking on this button, which upgrade your NuGet package to the latest stable version. And again, I accept the license. And you can see these two NuGet packages are updated to the latest version. And the third way is going to update and select all the NuGet packages that I want to be updated, and then I click the update. And then I accept the license and wait for installation. And then you can check in the installed section, and all my NuGet packages are updated, and then I can build the solution to find whether I have any errors or not. Fortunately, I don't have any error, and the project is built successfully, and I can run the project with the .NET Framework 6. And we successfully upgraded our .NET Framework from version 5 to version 6, and project is up and running. And from this session, we will switch to Visual Studio 2022, and we will use .NET 6 as a .NET Framework version. And in this session, we create a repository which handles the CRUD operation, and I create another repository for working with SQL Server, and also we review how we can switch between the repository. Also, we review the way that we can upgrade our .NET Framework from version 5 to version 6. Thank you for watching this session. Don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel and follow us on our social media channels. Once more, thank you for being with us.